If you think this was just another connection that faded with time, you're about to realize it was never ordinary, because while you've been trying to move forward, they've been going through a spiritual awakening they can't escape, and by the end of this video you'll understand why this bond didn't break. It activated something in their soul that will change. You thought this connection was just about love, just about emotions, just about two people meeting at the right or wrong time, but what they are going through right now is far deeper than missing you, far deeper than regret, far deeper than longing, because they're experiencing a spiritual wake-up call through this bond and they cannot escape it no matter how hard they try to distract themselves, no matter how many new faces they entertain, no matter how loudly they tell themselves that they have moved on, because this bond did not come into their life to make them comfortable, it came to shake them awake, to tear down illusions, to confront them with the parts of themselves they tried to bury, and the moment you stepped into their world something ancient stirred inside them, something that felt familiar yet terrifying, like their soul recognized a mirror it was not ready to look into, and at first they may have labeled it chemistry, obsession, attraction, or even chaos, but what they were actually feeling was their spirit being activated, their old patterns being exposed, their emotional wounds rising to the surface demanding to be healed, and instead of understanding it they reacted the only way an unawakened heart knows how to react, with fear, with confusion, with distance, because awakening rarely feels gentle in the beginning, it feels like losing control. It feels like everything you thought you knew about yourself suddenly being questioned. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff realizing the ground you trusted was never solid, and this bond became that cliff for them. This bond became the force that pushed them to see how they run from intimacy, how they sabotage what feels real, how they settle for shallow connections because depth demands vulnerability, and vulnerability demands courage, and courage is something the ego fights with everything it has. So when you walked away or when distance grew between you, they thought relief would come, they thought space would silence the intensity, but instead the silence became louder than your presence ever was, because in that silence they were left alone with themselves, and without you there to distract them or to project onto, they had to sit with the discomfort of their own reflection, and that is when the wake-up call truly began, because this was never about losing you. It was about losing the false version of themselves they had been clinging to for years, the version that avoided accountability, the version that pretended not to care, the version that believed love was weakness, and this bond shattered that illusion piece by piece, forcing them to confront how deeply they actually feel, how much they actually care, how terrified they are of being seen completely, and the more they try to suppress it the more intense the internal pressure becomes, because spiritual awakenings do not politely knock. They break doors down, they dismantle structures, they expose truths that cannot be unseen, and you unknowingly became the catalyst for that process in their life. You became the trigger that activated growth they were postponing. You became the person who loved them in a way that made their defenses crumble, and once those defenses cracked open they could never fully rebuild them the same way again, which is why even if they try to move on, even if they pretend indifference, something inside them feels permanently altered, permanently shifted, because awakening changes the lens through which you see everything, and now they are beginning to recognize patterns they once justified. They are beginning to see how childhood wounds shaped their adult reactions, how fear of abandonment made them abandon first, how fear of rejection made them reject before they could be rejected, And these realizations are not comfortable, they are heavy, they are humbling, they are sometimes overwhelming. Because growth requires admitting where you were wrong, growth requires owning the pain you caused. Growth requires understanding that the connection you ran from was actually the lesson you needed most, and as this awareness deepens, they feel waves of regret, not just about you but about every opportunity they mishandled, every time they chose ego over honesty, every time they masked love with pride. And this is the spiritual wake-up call, not angels appearing in the sky, not dramatic miracles, but the quiet, relentless inner voice that refuses to let them stay asleep anymore, the voice that says you cannot keep repeating the same cycles, you cannot keep blaming others for your unhealed wounds, you cannot keep sabotaging what your soul has been asking for. And sometimes this awakening shows up in their dreams, where you appear not as a memory but as a symbol, a reminder of the person who stirred something sacred inside them. Sometimes it shows up in moments of loneliness, when surrounded by people yet feeling disconnected, because once you taste a soul-deep bond, superficial interactions feel empty, and they begin to notice that emptiness more sharply now. They begin to crave authenticity instead of attention, depth instead of distraction, meaning instead of noise, and that craving is evidence of transformation, evidence that their spirit is evolving beyond the version of themselves that once ran from you. And evolution always involves shedding old beliefs, shedding outdated identities, shedding relationships that mirror who they used to be instead of who they are becoming. And this shedding process can feel like chaos, like everything falling apart at once, but what is actually happening is alignment, because when a soul wakes up, it can no longer tolerate what keeps it small, it can no longer comfortably sit in environments that suppress growth, it can no longer ignore the truth it once tried to bury. And the truth in this case is that this bond was divinely timed to wake them up, to push them toward maturity, to challenge their emotional immaturity, to break generational patterns they swore they would never repeat yet unconsciously did. And now they are seeing how you represented a higher standard, how you demanded emotional presence, how you refused to accept breadcrumbs, and at the time that may have felt threatening to them because it exposed their limitations, but now it feels inspiring because it shows them who they could become if they rise to the occasion. And this is the paradox of awakening. The same connection that once scared them now motivates them, the same intensity they once labeled as too much now feels like the benchmark for what real love should be. And as they grow through this realization, they begin to take accountability in ways they never have before, perhaps working on their communication, perhaps reflecting on their triggers, perhaps even seeking guidance or spiritual practices to understand why this bond shook them so deeply. And while they may not express this journey outwardly, internally, there is a revolution happening, a dismantling of ego structures, a rebuilding of emotional intelligence, a slow but undeniable shift from running to facing, from deflecting to owning, from sleeping to awakening. And through all of it, the energy of this bond remains like an anchor in their subconscious, reminding them of the moment their life divided into before and after, because that is what true spiritual connections do. They create a before and after timeline, a clear marker of who you were prior to awakening and who you are becoming because of it. And even if reconciliation never happens, the transformation itself is the purpose, because sometimes the role of a soulmate is not to stay forever but to ignite forever change, to serve as the catalyst that forces growth that comfort never could. And they are beginning to understand that now, beginning to see that losing you was not punishment but consequence. Not cruelty but curriculum, a lesson designed to teach them self-awareness, emotional responsibility, and spiritual depth, and the more they integrate these lessons, the more gratitude slowly replaces resistance, the more clarity replaces confusion, the more humility replaces pride, and they start to realize that this wake-up call is a gift even though it arrived disguised as heartbreak, because heartbreak has a way of cracking the chest open wide enough for light to enter, wide enough for suppressed truth to finally breathe, and as that light expands within them they may feel an urge to make amends, not from desperation but from understanding, not from loneliness but from alignment, because awakened energy does not chase out of fear, it approaches out of authenticity, and whether or not they reach out, what matters most is that they are no longer the same person who once misunderstood this bond. They are no longer asleep to their own emotional depth. They are no longer comfortable pretending indifference, because once a soul wakes up it cannot willingly return to unconsciousness, and this is the silent transformation happening behind the scenes. This is the spiritual wake-up call unfolding in layers, in realizations, in quiet nights of reflection, in sudden moments of clarity during ordinary days, and you may not witness every stage of it but trust that the impact of this bond is etched into their spirit in a way time cannot erase, because true awakening leaves a permanent imprint, a new awareness that reshapes decisions, relationships, and self-perception, and one day they will look back at this chapter not as the moment they lost you but as the moment they found themselves, the moment they were forced to grow, the moment their soul was called to evolve beyond fear, beyond ego, beyond avoidance, and that is the power of a bond that serves as a spiritual wake-up call. It does not merely connect two hearts, it transforms them, it elevates them. It demands that they become the highest version of who they were always meant to be, and through this bond, whether they were ready or not, their awakening has begun, and as this awakening continues to unfold within them, it does not move in a straight line or follow a predictable path, because spiritual growth is rarely neat and never convenient. It arrives in waves, in moments of clarity followed by moments of resistance, in nights where they feel empowered by new understanding, and mornings where the weight of their realizations feels almost unbearable, because waking up means you can no longer blame fate for what was fear, you can no longer call destiny cruel when it was your own avoidance creating distance, and this bond keeps replaying in their mind not as a memory to romanticize but as a mirror that reflects who they were and who they are slowly becoming, and the more they examine it the more they begin to see that the intensity they once tried to escape was actually the depth their soul had been craving for years. That the discomfort they felt was not incompatibility but growth. Pressure, the kind that stretches you beyond familiar limitations and forces you to confront truths you have postponed since childhood, and in this process they are starting to recognize how much of their identity was built on survival rather than authenticity, how much of their emotional expression was filtered through defense mechanisms designed to protect them from old wounds rather than allow them to experience new love. And this realization is humbling because it strips away the illusion that they were fully self-aware. It reveals blind spots they never acknowledged, patterns they thought were personality traits but were actually trauma responses, and suddenly the narrative changes from, "This connection was too much" to, "I was not ready for something this real," and that shift in perspective is the heart of the wake-up call. Because when accountability replaces blame, transformation accelerates. And now they are beginning to feel the difference between ego and soul more clearly than ever before. The ego whispers pride, distance, control, and emotional detachment as strength, but the soul whispers vulnerability, honesty, growth, and emotional presence as true power, and for the first time they are questioning which voice they have been listening to all along, because this bond exposed how exhausting it is to live behind a mask, how draining it is to pretend indifference when your heart is quietly breaking, how lonely it feels to prioritize being right over being real. And the loneliness they feel now is not simply about missing you, it is about recognizing how disconnected they have been from themselves, how often they abandoned their own truth to maintain an image, how frequently they avoided depth because depth required them to confront insecurities they preferred to ignore, and this confrontation is intense because once you see your own sabotage you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the pattern you can no longer comfortably repeat it without feeling internal conflict, and that internal conflict is proof that awakening is happening, because awareness creates friction with old habits, and they feel that friction every time they try to revert back to who they used to be, every time they attempt to numb the feelings instead of processing them, every time they consider settling for a connection that does not challenge them the way this one did, and what once felt thrilling now feels shallow. What once felt safe now feels stagnant, because growth has altered their emotional standards whether they consciously admit it or not, and as this awareness deepens they may start noticing synchronicities, subtle reminders, repeated themes that pull their thoughts back to this bond, not to torment them but to reinforce the lesson, to ensure they integrate the wisdom rather than suppress it, because the universe does not trigger awakening just to let it fade away. It reinforces it until transformation is complete, and in quiet moments they begin to replay conversations not to relive them but to understand them, to see where they deflected instead of communicated, where they withdrew instead of opened up, where they allowed fear to speak louder than love. And these reflections are not comfortable but they are necessary, because true spiritual growth requires honesty without excuses, and slowly they are learning to sit with their emotions rather than run from them, to feel regret without drowning in it, to accept responsibility without collapsing into shame, and this balance marks maturity, marks evolution, marks the difference between someone who remains asleep and someone who is truly waking up, and as they wake up they also begin to understand your role in their life differently, no longer seeing you as the source of their discomfort but as the catalyst for their expansion, the person who unknowingly held up a mirror to their highest potential. And instead of resentment there is now gratitude forming, quiet but powerful, because they realize that without this bond they might have continued repeating cycles for years, might have continued mistaking emotional avoidance for independence, might have continued believing that intensity was danger rather than depth, and this gratitude does not erase the pain but it reframes it, it transforms heartbreak into curriculum, it turns loss into initiation, because that is what spiritual wake-up calls truly are. Initiations into a higher level of self-awareness, and once initiated you cannot go back to the innocence of ignorance, you cannot comfortably return to unconscious patterns without feeling the cost, and that cost now feels heavier than the effort required to grow, so they begin choosing differently in small ways first, perhaps being more honest with others, perhaps acknowledging emotions sooner instead of bottling them up, perhaps apologizing where pride once kept them silent. And these small choices accumulate into larger shifts, shifts in mindset, shifts in behavior, shifts in what they are willing to tolerate, and through it all this bond remains the reference point, the benchmark that silently guides their evolution, because awakening does not always mean immediate reunion or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it means becoming the person who would not sabotage that love again, becoming emotionally equipped to handle the depth that once overwhelmed you, becoming spiritually mature enough to understand that true connection is not meant to be escaped but embraced, and whether or not paths cross again, the truth remains that this bond has permanently altered their trajectory. It has disrupted complacency, it has exposed fear, it has ignited introspection, and it has planted seeds of consciousness that will continue to grow long after the initial storm has passed. And one day when they fully integrate these lessons, they will recognize this chapter as sacred, not because it was easy but because it was transformative, because it forced them to meet themselves at a level they had avoided for years, because it demanded authenticity over ego, courage over comfort, evolution over repetition, and in that recognition they will understand that the spiritual wake-up call was not a punishment for loving you, it was a blessing disguised as disruption, a divine push toward becoming who they were always meant to be. And through this bond their spirit has begun a journey that cannot be undone, a journey toward truth, toward depth, toward a version of themselves that no longer runs from the very love their soul has been seeking all along. And as time continues to move forward, the transformation inside them becomes less about reacting to the pain of the connection and more about integrating the wisdom it awakened, because what began as confusion slowly evolves into clarity, what began as emotional chaos gradually becomes conscious reconstruction, and they start to understand that this spiritual wake-up call was never about forcing them back toward you out of desperation but about pulling them toward themselves with honesty. And that distinction changes everything, because when awakening matures it shifts from obsession with what was lost to responsibility for what must be built within, and they are now standing in that space where excuses no longer feel satisfying, where blaming timing or circumstances feels shallow compared to the deeper truth that fear played a larger role than they ever admitted, and facing that truth requires humility. It requires acknowledging that the very intensity they once criticized was actually the depth their spirit needed to evolve, and this realization humbles them in ways they cannot easily express to anyone else, because spiritual awakenings are deeply personal, often invisible from the outside, yet seismic on the inside, reshaping belief systems, challenging long-held narratives, and dissolving the false strength they once clung to. And in this dissolution there is grief, not just for the connection but for the version of themselves that sabotaged it, grief for the opportunities they mishandled, for the words they swallowed, for the vulnerability they withheld. And this grief is not weakness but evidence of consciousness expanding, because only an awakened heart feels the full weight of what it once avoided, and instead of numbing that weight they are beginning to sit with it, to let it teach rather than torment, to let it refine rather than define them. And through this refinement their understanding of love begins to mature beyond fantasy and beyond fear, because they now recognize that real love is not about possession or control but about growth, alignment, and emotional courage. And this bond forced them to confront how unprepared they were for that level of authenticity, how quickly they retreated when asked to be fully present, how instinctively they guarded themselves when intimacy deepened. And these patterns no longer feel invisible to them, they feel obvious, undeniable. And once something becomes undeniable it cannot be comfortably repeated, and this is where true change begins. in the discomfort of awareness that refuses to be silenced, and so they begin reconstructing themselves from the inside out, examining childhood conditioning, questioning inherited beliefs about relationships, unlearning narratives that equated vulnerability with danger, and slowly they start practicing a new way of being, one where communication replaces assumption, where emotional availability replaces avoidance, where accountability replaces defensiveness. And though this process is gradual, it is genuine. Because awakening that is rushed rarely lasts, but awakening that is earned through reflection becomes permanent, and as permanence settles in, they start to see this bond not as unfinished business but as sacred initiation, something that entered their life to catalyze growth at a pace comfort would never have allowed, and even if pride once prevented them from acknowledging the impact, internally they now recognize that their life divided into two chapters the moment this connection began, the chapter of unconscious repetition and the chapter of conscious evolution. And they are no longer interested in returning to the first chapter, because once you experience the clarity of self-awareness, even if it is painful, ignorance feels heavier than truth, and so they carry forward the lessons, the introspection, the heightened sensitivity to authenticity, and this heightened awareness changes how they interact with the world. It makes superficial conversations feel hollow. It makes emotionally unavailable dynamics feel draining. It makes them crave substance over stimulation, and this craving is not about you specifically anymore, but about alignment with who they are becoming. Because awakening elevates standards naturally, it recalibrates the heart to seek resonance rather than convenience, and in that recalibration they may begin to realize that what they once feared losing was actually the version of themselves that felt safe but stagnant, and what they gained through this disruption was depth, emotional intelligence, and spiritual maturity, and these gains cannot be undone. They cannot be unlearned, they cannot be erased by time or distance, and perhaps the most profound shift is that they are beginning to forgive themselves, not in a way that dismisses accountability but in a way that acknowledges growth, because shame keeps people stuck but conscious responsibility sets them free, and freedom is what awakening ultimately offers, freedom from denial, freedom from repetitive cycles, freedom from the ego's constant need to protect an image, and as they step into that freedom they feel lighter yet more grounded, more aware yet less reactive, more open yet more discerning, and through this balance they understand that the spiritual wake-up call was not random, it was aligned with their soul's readiness to evolve even if their mind resisted it at first. And readiness does not always look like confidence, sometimes it looks like chaos preceding clarity, and they had to move through that chaos to arrive at this awareness. And now when they reflect on this bond there is less panic and more reverence, less desperation and more gratitude, because they see how perfectly it exposed what needed healing, how precisely it targeted the wounds that required attention, how intentionally it disrupted comfort to create expansion, and whether paths intertwine again or continue separately, the truth remains that they will never experience love the same way they did before. Because this awakening has recalibrated their perception permanently, it has shown them the cost of avoidance and the reward of authenticity. It has revealed that intensity is not something to escape but something to understand, and most importantly it has introduced them to a version of themselves that is capable of depth, vulnerability, and conscious choice, and that introduction is irreversible, and so as this chapter integrates fully into their being they step forward changed. Not because they lost you but because through this bond they found the courage to confront themselves, and in that confrontation their spirit rose from sleep into awareness, from fear into growth, from ego into truth, and that is the lasting power of a spiritual wake-up call. It does not simply stir emotions for a season, it reshapes identity for a lifetime, ensuring that whoever they become from this point onward carries the imprint of this bond not as unfinished longing but as awakened wisdom that continues guiding them toward their highest, most conscious self.